Rob here, I've seen from space. This is the Elektron Analog 4, and I'm going to be doing another short tutorial, this time on using the effects. We're going to look at how to manage the effects on the Analog 4 in the context of a kit, and also how the individual synth sounds are configured so that they sit within the mix. Because that's what a kit is more than anything else. It's a mix containing 4 synths, their relative levels and the global effects settings. Now I've programmed a pattern with, as you'd expect, 4 synth sounds and some effects settings, and we can look at this as an example of how to fine-tune the kit so it sounds nice in your song. This is what it sounds like altogether. Now something that's important to understand about the Analog 4 is that the chemistry, if that's what you want to call it, between a synth sound and the effects has 2 parts to it. Now the first is the global settings in the effects track. Now if I go into the effects track, I have these 4 screens here, the chorus, delay, reverb and LFO, that let me adjust the settings for these different effects. I can do things like change the decay time on the reverb, and there's a few other settings in there. The other main aspect to this chemistry that I'm on about is the send levels for each of the synth sounds. So I'm going to select track 1, and here we're in the editing screens for the synth on this track. I'll go into the amp screen, which is where the effects sends are. Now this is important to understand. These determine the levels of each effect for this sound, and you save this as part of the synth sound. And I'll just play the sound that's on track 1. But if I reckon that this sound needs a longer or a shorter reverb tail, for example, then I have to set that in the global effects for the whole kit. So you'll probably find yourself switching backwards and forwards between the sound edit and the effects edit screens to get the perfect setting. Now again, because this is going to be the reverb for the whole kit, there might be compromises you'll have to make if you want to apply reverb to the other 3 sounds. And exactly the same goes for the delay and chorus too. Now, one rather big implication of this is that if I reuse the same sound in a different song, which might have very different effects requirements, let's go to there. You can, for track 1, you can see the effect sends there, the different levels. Now, in this new song, you might find that these send levels don't work so well in that context, so I might be inclined to tweak them. I might say, well, I have a bit less delay there, a bit more chorus or whatever. But if I then save that, it would then affect how that sound sat in the mix in my first song. So that's definitely something to bear in mind there when you're managing your saved sounds. Luckily, the newer OS versions have tons of storage, so you can just save it as a new sound. It's a bit of a compromise with the Analog 4. It's not like some other synths that have multi-timbral effects. Now, let's just listen to that briefly. I've got quite a lush reverb set here. With long reverbs, you have to be quite careful which sounds you use with them, and that's a general production point. There's nothing particular to the Analog 4. So the this high-pitched sort of plinky sounds rather nice with a long reverb. But if I switch to the, let's just have the bass sound. No, I've selected the effects send screen for this. And if I start to add this rather rich reverb to the bass sound, very quickly it starts to sound rather muddy. Now if I was determined to have some reverb on that bass sound, then what I could do is go back into the effects track and pick the, yes, I'm in the reverb screen for that. I could roll off the high pass filter on the reverb so that only the sort of higher harmonics are reverberating. and you can hear that starts to sound quite a bit cleaner. That's not too bad. But if I go back to that high-pitched sound and see what that sounds like now, I mean that reverb is now beginning to sound really rather thin. See the difference if I... not that one. That's the original setting. And going back to a very filtered reverb, it sounds, well, it sounds okay, but not terribly interesting. So let's go back to the bass sound, and am I on the right screen? Yes. Yep, right screen. Let's take off the reverb. You can hear that there's a little bit of delay there, which makes it sound quite bouncy. It's a ping-pong delay, and that can have quite nice results with bass sequences. It sort of adds to the rhythmic nature of the track. Now I'm going to go into the delay screen in the global FX track, and you can see here that there's a little amount of reverb that I've added to this. Now this parameter here allows you to add a bit of reverb on each repeat of the delay, and this can sound very nice indeed, but you have to use this with care. If you've got a bass sound, for example, on one track, any delay effect you add to that will also reverberate, and that can muddy your mix considerably. So I would recommend using this with care. One way of doing it is with a very minimal setting like this, so that there's a tiny amount of reverb on each of those little delays on that bass sound. On all the sounds indeed, or when you're only adding delay to one or two tracks where it actually does sound quite good in quite a heavy delay sort of context, and also when you're using the Analog 4 polyphonically, where you're basically just using one sound and you tailor the sound accordingly to that. But as always, let your ears be the judge. But it's very good to be aware of the risks of this. Now, when assembling a mix using global effects like on the Analog 4, it's a good idea to use different send levels for each of the four sounds. Now, if I'm on the right screen there for track 1, 2, 3, 4. You can see that the reverb settings are different for each track. Now, the illusion is, when you add different amounts of reverb, is that the instruments sit at different distances. The more reverb you add, the further away the sound. And the four different timbres will sound less crowded if each occupies its own it occupies its own space. If we go to this sort of shaker sound, see, it's got a little bit of reverb in it already. If I increase the reverb, see, the illusion is that it's getting further and further away. And you might find subjectively that the more reverb you add, the louder it seems. Now that actually does seem to be slightly louder than it was when it was drier. So you might have to pull back a bit on the level if you add lots of reverb to a sound, just so it balances out. Otherwise the reverb can become a little bit overwhelming. So I'll put it back to the original settings. Whoops, that's the wrong knob. Zero that. Put that back roughly where it was. And that's the full mix. And there's a sort of illusion that these four different sounds are all at different distances.